welcome. We are also recording for our YouTube channel. But if you're going to be watching this by YouTube, I'm going to invite you to go to my Periscope page to watch the entire broadcast. So my YouTubies, we're only doing snippets over here. And we want you to go to the to the Periscope, periscope.tv/Life Nation to catch the entire episode. So, good morning. I hope everybody is doing well. This is Daring Dialogues. And today we are going to be talking, as promised, Today we're going to be talking, as promised, about love and marriage. Welcome, Resilient Warrior. Glad to see you in the house today. And we're going to be talking about this book, Getting Serious About Getting Married. And her subtitle is Rethinking the Gift of Singleness. So this is going to be a informative and intense topic today, because a lot of what she does talk about, I know for a fact that many people, and especially many churches, are not talking about what she's talking about. So if you have a moment while we're kind of waiting for maybe a few more people to come in, if you would swipe and invite your followers as we come in today. Also, if you'd like to check out what some of the news topics have been in the last 24 hours, you can check out our Facebook page, which is Daring Dialogues. That's our Facebook page. And there's plenty of articles for you to check out that are not really in the mainstream, but they're still very important topics. Welcome. Anyone who likes to dialogue and who likes to have conversation and can do that without profanity, and they can do that without perversion, is always welcome in this space. So the minute I see profanity, or the minute I see racial slurs, or the minute I see, just disrespect for the space, I will block you. So I just want to make that clear. If you come into this space speaking another language or speaking Russian, I'm probably going to block you. So just to kind of get that out of the way. All right. So, rethinking the gift of singleness, getting serious about getting married. Just a little bit about myself. I have been married for the past 16 years. This year will make year 17. And I've known my husband for a little over 20 years. So I am not a newbie to this topic. We have counseled many couples through all kinds of, I would say, marital issues. Some have been able to receive what we're saying and, reconcile and move on and move forward in a healthy relationship. Some, unfortunately, one party was unwilling to do that. And there you go. One party was unwilling to, one of the or the other party was unwilling to do that. And so some couples did have to part ways. We've handled all different kinds of marriage counseling, from mental and emotional abuse to physical abuse, to just, new couples finding their way and navigating their way through the marital process. And so that is just a little bit of background on myself and my husband. We also have a playlist on our YouTube channel called Relationships that cover some of the questions and things you want to ask your significant other before you say I do. So we do have some teaching videos on that. And we have seen that those have been very helpful to those who are in relationship. This young lady, Debbie Macon, after reading some reviews of her book came out in, 2006. And a lot of people reamed her for what she was saying concerning singles. A lot of theologians came after her, saying that she didn't have a degree in theology, and some of her concepts were along the camp of what they call the marriage mandate camp. Now, I believe that singleness is a blessing and marriage is a blessing. But I also had to look at it from Debbie Macon's perspective. Debbie Macon is of Indian ethnicity. And so her perspective on marriage, of course, was going to buck a little bit against American societal's perspective on marriage. But she does a really good job of laying a foundation of historically what marriage was for. And she gives foundational proof for it. And so while I don't necessarily agree with all of her premises in her book, she does make some very good points. Now, I would be interested in seeing what some of these same people who got on her about her themes in her book, what they would say now, 11 years later. Because a lot of the things that she talked about in here and warned people on concerning marriage and family and singlehood, now you hear a lot of what she was saying, but it wasn't very popular for her as a woman to say it back in 2006. I'm just going to put it out there. Good morning. And so a lot of what she's saying about males, a lot of what she's saying about men taking the lead, a lot of what she's saying about men stepping up and being responsible, I am now hearing some of those same things in the Christian world. But when she was saying them and when she wrote this book, she got told off about what she was saying. But here we are a decade later, and now you can actually see that what she was saying was not just off the top of her head, but I really believe that she was probably ahead of her time. And of course, the fact that she was a woman making these suppositions about what was happening in American culture in regards to love and singleness and marriage, I think that kind of ticked off the male influencers in the theological world. So, like I said, I don't necessarily agree with all of her premises, but a lot of the points that she makes do make sense, and they are sound points. All right. So, of course, I'm not going to be able to read all of this book in one setting, but I did want to cover some of the things that she talked about, and I'll be looking at chapter 3 and chapter 4 today, and page 94. Again, as you're coming in, this is Getting Serious About Getting Married, Rethinking the Gift of Singleness, and I would ask that you swipe and invite your followers, or send a request for your followers to join us today, so that even if they aren't able to join us live, they can catch it on the replay. All right. So again, Debbie Macon's perspective is that she was an Indian woman who saw that she was, 28, still single, and she decided to do what she called was employ agency, or employ the help of others in helping her to select a mate. Now, that is a huge deal. You've got all kinds of dating sites, social media sites, even apps that help people to employ some help in finding and selecting a mate. So, like I said, what she was talking about a decade ago, people are now actively doing. So her first chapter that we're going to look at, she talks about historical views on marriage and singleness, right? And she said, as she was learning, she said the reason that they were husbandless, because at this time she was about 28, she said had very little to do with us. There wasn't much to separate us from single women in the 1960s or the 1730s or even 500 BC. Just like them, we wanted husbands who would love and care for us. We wanted a bunch of little ones who would tug at our skirts and sing in the children's choir. Our advanced educational degrees hardly differentiated us, because those women had their work and so do we. Even Deborah, seen in the Bible as one of Israel's judges, had a husband. So what had changed? What had changed was how society viewed marriage and singleness, and how uniformly past cultures agreed on the mandate for marriage. What had changed was how seriously families took on the responsibility to see their daughters married. What had changed was the formality with which the marriage search was launched versus the chaotic informality of today. What had changed was that we were no longer living in a culture where marriage was prized and we were paying the consequences. What had changed was that we no longer agreed on an objective definition of marriage. This is the discussion that I began with my friend and continues today. I want you to evaluate where we were and where we are now and how we can return, so to speak. For this discussion, we must acknowledge that Scripture is the basis for all knowledge and wisdom. This is why the 2 chapters you just read were critical. Without an understanding of what Scripture says about marriage, its intended purpose, its universal application, its ever so limited exception of singleness, we lack a framework to examine whether past cultures were correct in what they believed about marriage. So, the first thing that she's saying here is, throughout the ages, almost all cultures, right, have believed that marriage was the rule and singleness was the exception. Now, I'm going to pause right there because we all know that we're now living in a culture where singleness is the rule and marriage is becoming the exception. So one of the things that she's pointing out here is that most cultures in the past believed that marriage was the rule and singleness was the exception. In particular, she goes on to say, the church adhered to the position that the Bible both commended and commanded marriage. Now, one of the things that she talks about here is that the Bible commands marriage, which she really does not have a premise for the command of marriage, but there is a premise for the commending of marriage, right? And there is a premise for being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth with people. And you're supposed to do that in the context of marriage. Marriage was defined as a permanent union of 2 mentally fit and able-bodied people, 1 man and 1 woman for life. This union had 2 purposes: mutual comfort and producing the next generation. John Witt, author From Sacrament to Contract, says, the duty of marriage stems from God's command that the man and woman unite, help each other, beget children, and raise them as God's servants. Marriage was an expected part of life and the benchmark of reaching adulthood. It was a firm conviction among the reformers that all persons should heed the duty and accept the gift of marriage for the sake of both society and each person within it. Martin Luther, in his famous sermon, The Estate of Marriage, said, after God made them male and female, he blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. From this passage, we may be assured that man and woman should and must come together in order to multiply. Hence, as it is not within my power not to be a man, so it is not my prerogative to be without a woman. Again, as it is not in your power not to be a woman, so it is not your prerogative to be without a man. For it is not a matter of necessarily free choice, but a natural and necessary thing that whatever is a man must have a woman, and whatever is a woman must have a man. Be fruitful and multiply is more than a command, namely a divine ordinance which is not our prerogative to hinder or ignore. Rather, it is just as necessary as the fact that I'm a man, and more necessary than sleeping and waking. It is a nature and disposition just as innate as the organs involved in it. Therefore, just as God does not command anyone to be a man or woman, but creates them the way they have to be, so he does not command them to multiply, but creates them so that they have to multiply. And wherever men try to resist this, it remains irresistible nonetheless and goes its way through fornication, adultery, and secret sins. And for this is a matter of nature and not of choice. So one of the things that she's pointing out here is that the early church right? Martin Luther and all them. The early church believed that marriage was something that came by the nature of how God created us to come together and be fruitful and multiply. Again, this is not something I'm hearing being taught in churches. It's just not. Then he says, whenever you try to resist how God has made you by nature, he says you're going to go through the way of fornication, adultery, and secret sins, because this is not just a matter of nature or the way that God created man and female, male and female, right? The way that you have been created to come together and multiply, right? So that's what she's saying here, that if you escape this concept that God has laid out in Scripture about marriage and being fruitful and multiplying, ultimately you're going to wind up in fornication or adultery or secret sin. And there's very few people that can live a celibate life without winding up in those three things. Because celibacy is a supernatural gift. Say that one more time. If you try to escape this natural thing that God has set up for the male and the female, right, to be fruitful and to multiply, to replenish the earth through the covenant of marriage, what the early church fathers understood that is not taught today is that if you try to resist this concept, you're either going to wind up in fornication, adultery, or secret sins. Martin Luther said, for it is a matter of nature and not of choice. In other words, it's the matter of how God set male and female to be with one another in the earth. And there are very few people that can actually live a quote-unquote single life free from sexual temptation, because it is a supernatural gift. Celibacy is not meant to be a permanent thing for everybody. That's what they're getting at. I know our world wants to make that the case. I know we want to eventually create human beings. I know we want to eventually create robotic people and all of these different, scientific things that we have going on, right? But this is a matter of nature and not of choice. That's what the early church fathers were telling and teaching at the time. All right. Now she goes on to say, John Calvin echoed these sentiments, saying that the choice to marry is not put in our own hands as if we were to deliberate on the matter. He considered those who willfully rejected marriage to be carefree and foolish. Past Christians acknowledge that God created men and women in a very specific way to fulfill specific commands, and therefore their very natures would make them seek marriage as the viable solution to fulfill the command. Now, this is not rocket science that they were talking about. They were saying God made men and women specifically to be able to fill the command of being fruitful and multiplying in the context of the covenant of marriage. This was understood in the past. Now we get to 2017 and people are acting like they don't understand. So that's why I say we kind of need to go back to some foundational truths about